Good morning, everyone. As Jonathan explained, I am the Quality Assurance and Release Manager for Eaton Vance. A little bit about Eaton Vance. We're a Boston-based investment management company. We've been around quite some time. We go back to 1924, so we are one of the oldest investment management firms in the United States. We have about 1,300 employees in the organization. And as you see there, currently we have about 273 billion in assets under management. And as I said before, I've been here since 2005 and have held many roles within the organization since that time. So let's begin to talk about where Eaton Vance was at a point in time where I got into release management. When I got into, before 2008, when I moved into the release management space, we really didn't have a whole lot of structure within the organization. As you can see there, we didn't have policy. A lot of things were being done via email, which email is a nice way to communicate things, but it's really hard to manage and organize things when you're running things based on an email process. And one of the things we needed to do was we really needed to change that. But also for doing releases, without having automation in place, having a development background, everything we did was based on coding of the developer. And a lot of times that is prone to error. So we were doing a lot of things in a manual fashion. And that was something that actually needed to move forward and needed to change. So back in 2008, once I took over, and moving right up to 2013, not a whole lot of things changed overnight. And as you can imagine, in many organizations, change doesn't happen overnight. It has to take some time to change. So that gap between 2008 and 2013 was a transition to where we wanted to be. But we were very decentralized, and a lot of the decentralization was really because we did have a manual process. And we had other people that needed to do certain releases, and they were doing them in a certain fashion. So not everybody was doing things exactly the same way, and we wanted to change that. With a manual process, we do have a lot of stuff that's under source control, so we have some controls in place, but it still wasn't a cohesive release process. So when it came to doing releases, getting stuff out of the source control system was a matter of saving files to maybe a file share, and in order to get that information or those files into the proper servers, we'd have to RDP to different servers to maybe pull those files in, or run an exe to install an application. And those things were kind of tedious. And the problems you have there is that while you have one department that might do it, which is where we got to, not everybody is still going to do it the same way because it's not a cohesive system. We did get to a point where we got away from the email process by utilizing a SharePoint-based system, which we had brought into the organization for other purposes in the organization. And I found SharePoint at the time to be a wonderful way for people to submit requests to me and for us to communicate what was going on with the release management process. However, because it was a rather large system and there was a lot going on in SharePoint, sometimes the responsiveness of the SharePoint system wasn't quite what we wanted it to be from a release management standpoint. We didn't have adequate security built into what we were doing in the SharePoint site. So we still had some issues there that we wanted to really resolve. And one of the bigger problems that we had is that when a user was submitting information into the release management process, because we have change management, which really controls the process of things going into the production environment and the true source of authorization and approvals, we had no connections between what was being done in release management and what had to happen in the change management system in order for people to get their changes authorized and approved for release into the production environment. So we were very, very disjointed and disconnected. And that was something that obviously we need to change, because you need a good vision from the request all the way through to production to understand when it was requested and when it actually got to production. Some of the releases we do they're varied. A lot of stuff we do is a lot of PHP based applications. We still have some VB6 applications that are running around our organization, and as you know, sometimes people will tell you, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And we have a lot of ASP. But some of the other things we do that go along with our web-based application, our desktop-based applications, we have a lot of database stuff that we have to do. So many times, because we have so much stuff going on in stored procedures, we do a lot of stuff at the data layer that can implement features that the interface needs. So we do a lot of standalone deployments that are completely database related, as well as we have a ETL process where we do a lot of transformation of data. So those applications are being written on a consistent basis, and those also have to be released. And we have a workload automation process that we're in charge of releasing as well. So we have a lot of different types of applications that we release. And while those methodologies of how we release those different types of applications are different, the process we go through for somebody submitting to us the information that we need, that needs to be consistent. How we handle those releases across those 4 different categories needed to be very, very consistent. In many instances, I can start a process and get everything rolled out to the UAT environment, but I might not be the person that's actually moving that process into the production environment. At that point, when you're a manual process, you might do things slightly different, which in essence can cause some problems. That was one of the reasons we really, really started to walk the path of getting into moving towards automation, because we wanted to streamline that process. Now, the way our release process works, we're not aware of a release coming down until they actually submit the request to us. As you see from this flow here, a business change request goes directly to the developer. The developer will do their work, and at the time that they're ready to move that work into the UAT environment for testing, that's when we will know that that request or that there's work for us to do. So we're not aware of changes that are coming down the pipe. So there's not a big, long meeting or a long time between when we're told that it's coming down and it's actually going to come down. When it comes down is exactly the point that we know that it's coming. Now, in the UAT environment, obviously a developer can go round and round in UAT until he's got his code or his changes or his features exactly the way that the users need them to be before they're going to go to the production environment. So for us, once they're done in the UAT environment, obviously we go to the business owner and CAB approval, and then that goes into production. Where we were, as I said earlier, with the manual system, is that anything that was going through the UAT environment, while it can go round and round in that UAT environment, because our change management system was very disconnected from our release management system, we never knew when the developer was actually done testing. So we would really never know when it was actually going to production because those two systems was disconnected. Again, at that point, we wouldn't know that a change is ready to go to production until we actually get notified by the change management system that we have work to do to move a particular change or particular release into the production environment. So we needed to really bring all that together so that we have a clear vision and a clear understanding of where releases are along the path, whether it's still in UAT, whether it's ready to go to production, whether the user is still working on it. we wanted to have that information readily available to us, which is something we didn't have before. When I talked about we used SharePoint to do a lot of the communication back and forth with the user, in essence, SharePoint was our release control system. And literally, it really didn't have a whole lot behind it. It was really just a matter of telling us, well, somebody has submitted something, and we've successfully put it into the UAT environment. So there was a piece missing here with our release management control with SharePoint because of, again, that disconnectedness that it had from our production environment. And because we didn't have that visibility into, well, has the developer completed all of their testing? Has the developer now moved it into a process where he's waiting for approvals? We didn't have that information readily available to us. We would have to go into our change management system in order to get that information. A lot of that was a very, very, again, disconnected and wasn't fluid enough for us. And that's where a lot of our problems came when it came to timing and how quickly we could respond to our developers. With the SharePoint system, while we got a notification that, hey, there's something to do there, when we get that notification, the user assumes that we're starting the process of getting that release moving out. And we are. The problem is on the back end, it's still a very manual process. So when I went back and when I said that we were taking files out of our SharePoint system or taking files out of our source control system or logging onto servers to do manual releases, that's what the developer is waiting for before we can tell them that something has successfully been moved into the UAT environment. So there was no concept for them of how quickly things could move because it was taking us a really long time to get it to a point where they would know that we were ready. And as you see here from this screen, we actually used 3 different colors on this screen. We used red, yellow, and green. Obviously, green means things are all good. The initial state is blue, which meant that it was submitted. We know about it, but we haven't done anything with it yet. So to get to a state of green, they don't know how long that's going to take because they really didn't know what was going on in the background to facilitate us to get their releases out into the UAT environment. So when I sat back and came to the logical conclusion that we needed to do better, we needed to provide our development department a better solution. I consider the developers my customers. And to facilitate providing better service to my customers, I have to get better with what I do, which I sat down and thought about how I can improve the release management process as a whole. The improvements were across 3 different things. I really, really needed to centralize all the release process so that everything goes through the same exact methodology, the same exact release flow, which was one of the things I had to do. If you remember earlier in my presentation, I talked about different people were doing different releases only because it was the way it was done. By bringing that all into the release management department, we were able to completely streamline how every release in the organization is going to happen. Therefore, all the developers have to do is submit the information to us because the process was going to be uniform across everything that we was doing. So I really wanted to do that, and we took full responsibility and accountability for everything that goes into the UAT environment and the production environments, which helped us be much better at what we do. So now when a user puts in a request, they know exactly who they need to communicate with to understand, well, where in the process is that release? What's going on with that release? One of the other things I wanted to do was I needed to have it needed to be much, much more secure. Because we were manual, because we were decentralized, a lot of different people needed access to a lot of different things that they didn't necessarily need or should have access to. The centralization also allowed us to get a much, much better control around what the release management process was going to be and how it should be. And we also were able to step back and say, well, a developer should never have the ability to put their own code into UAT. So we actually, by centralizing and by really, really taking control of the entire process, we were able to introduce and really, really fulfill that need for separation of duties. Because obviously from an ITIL and a SOC and an audit perspective, you really don't want a developer putting his own work into a production and even a UAT environment. So we were able to introduce that as something we wanted to do as part of a process improvement. And the greater thing that I really, really wanted to introduce as process improvement was I really wanted to automate a lot of what we had done. Getting people to understand why I wanted to automate a lot of the release management process was relatively easy because, one, I'm the quality assurance manager, and we've done a tremendous amount of automation on our quality assurance side. And we've seen the benefits of automation from quality assurance. So moving that philosophy over to release management was very, very easy. It was a matter of how are we going to do it? Do we want to sit down? Do we want to write scripts? Which certainly we could have done because I'm a developer and my team is primarily people who understand the development process. So getting people to understand that we needed to do release automation was a really, really easy thing. The nice parts about doing the release automation is that it took us away from having to log on to different servers to do a release. If you have a release that's spanning multiple servers, that potentially could be logging onto 2 or 3 different servers in order to get all the pieces of that application released as part of your process. We wanted to eliminate that because that's where your bottleneck is. It takes time to log into this one, to log into that one, to log into another one. You might be able to get 3 people to do it all at once, but then you're talking about synchronization to make sure things happen in the proper flow. By doing the automation, that was going to be something that we could also control, which is what pieces need to be put out in what sequence. It would always be the same process in the same sequence for every time we did a release. So, why did I choose Serena? I looked at a couple of different vendors when it came to what I wanted to do from a improvement process. Now, it wasn't just the automation piece, because again, automation piece could have been done with scripting, whether it's done in Ruby or whether it's done in Windows Shell. We certainly could have done the automation by scripting. I chose not to go that way because, again, scripting, based on how you write scripts, someone has to really understand the language you're writing scripts in, and it presents a whole other sets of problems. But I also wanted to move away from the SharePoint system that we used for the users because it really, really wasn't very, very intuitive as to what was going on in the full span of the system. So I really wanted to find something that facilitated building a really, really user-friendly interface that would not present challenges to my developer community, because you need the buy-in of those developers to get them to shift even from something as simplistic as SharePoint to something else. So I needed to find a system that was very, very simple to use and that would be easily adoptable. And I found that when I went to the Serena system. Now, when I think about fit for purpose, I looked at a lot of different tools, as I said, and some of those tools, while they could do some of the things that I wanted, some of their main purpose might have been server automation, which is a little bit more industrial than I needed. Some of them didn't have the control that I was looking for. And it really became a matter of where can I find something that gives me all the pieces that I really wanted, from being able to design a very, very intuitive interface for my users, as well as have a lot of real centralized control, and be able to really, really automate my back end. So when I looked at Serena's tools and I saw that I could get the control that I needed, I can get the security that I wanted, which having something in the middle was really, really important, because I want to know at all times what code is in every environment that I'm doing releases to. That was, again, something we didn't have. I wouldn't be able to really tell you what was in a production state or what was in UAT, because we didn't have a way of really knowing that. And I really needed to have that in place as part of what I wanted to do to improve my environment. And I also had the realization that because our change management system is our system of records, and it really controls what goes into our production environment, I really needed a tool that was going to be customizable, whereby I can do the integrations that I needed with our change management system. And I found all of those things when I started looking at the Serena system, and that was the reasons that I made that choice to go with Serena. Our flow isn't really complex. Basically, when a user submits their request, we need to understand exactly what it is they're requesting, what artifacts need to be put into whichever environment they're going to, whether it's UAT and then on to production. So the release flow that was designed to facilitate what we were doing is very simplistic. We didn't want to go overboard on what we were changing at first, only because, again, sometimes change can be very difficult for people. We wanted to sort of take the flow that we had as a manual process and kind of automate that process as our first introduction of the entire system into the organization. So basically what we did was we took our manual process, not only automated the deployments on the back end, but we started to put a workflow in place to sort of make the flow of how we communicate back and forth and how things move through the process. We wanted to make that much easier. We wanted to make that very intuitive. We were able to do that by designing the release package and making some modifications to facilitate what we were doing and how we were doing it here at Advance. If you go back to when I showed you the SharePoint system, because the SharePoint system was really only UAT, we really had, again, no view into production. The nice thing about the release control part of the Serena Release Management Suite is that I have visibility into every release that's been submitted. I know exactly where those releases are in their life cycle, whether it's waiting to be developed by us to put it together for release, whether it's in the UAT environment, whether there were issues with the release and we had to send it back to the developer for additional work. We now have that information readily at our fingertips. And that information is actually available to our users as well. So our users can understand at any given point, where is my release? What's going on with my release? And that's very beneficial to our users. One of the things that many of our users have already talked about with us is the speed at which we turn around our releases. Because we've done automation, because we've integrated the system with the front end and the back end, because all of the stuff that we've done thus far, we have, without a doubt, increased our rate of deployments, because it now takes us a lot less time to do setup. Basically, any release we do now is close to a push of a button. And we're continuing to look for ways to improve our process, to increase our throughput for our users. And as you see from this screen, we know exactly when things happen. We know who did them, and we know where they are. And that's an important piece of some of the information that I wanted to have is I want to be able to know what's coming down the pipe. If there's 10 to 15 different releases in the UAT state, I know at some point those releases are going to be coming into the process to be ready for production, to be ready to go out to production. So we have a lot more information on our side than we used to have by having the SharePoint system. So the release control portion was extremely valuable, and it continues to be valuable for us.
Hey, Richard.
Yes.
It's Jonathan. So about that particular slide, you had some very useful, information there. I'm just wondering, you kept talking about how, it was information you wanted to see. How widely is that information shared in the rest of the organization? What visibility are you giving everybody else, and what value are they getting from it?
All of the developers who use the system readily have access to this information through either, on top of this, we put the request center, but they have access to this underlying as well. One of the things it's been able to do is many times with our manual system, developers call us to say, hey, what's going on with this release? Is it ready to go to production? Has it gone to production? So there was a lot of, I don't want to say miscommunication, but there was not a lot of readily available information to them. So now the developers have right at their fingertip, they have all the information they need to know where their pieces are, whether it's back in their bucket because it might need some additional work. They may have passed us incorrect information for doing the deployment. So the communication between the release management team and the developer community has increased. And because we use lots of information and comments, so if we send a release back to the developer, it's not in an email anymore. It's now readily in the system. If we need to make comments that, perhaps they actually sent us the request but forgot to check in their artifacts into the source system, we can readily tell them that. And we can have that communication back and forth without having it be email. So this information has been very valuable to them as well as the release management team.
Thanks, Richard.
Mm-hmm. So we've done a tremendous job of increasing our throughput and we really have minimalized any errors that we do, because right now much of what we feed into the system is minimalistic information in order to facilitate any releases. That was the main goal. The main goal was to get away from having a manual process and to automate as much as we possibly could about the system. The automation was the first piece we had done. So before we actually let the users in, and way before the users saw the benefits of what the entire system was doing, the release management team was already using the automation on the back end, because we really needed to flush out the automation pieces first. We were still using our SharePoint piece for them to submit information. Again, that was still disjointed, but we wanted to see how quickly we could turn around the automation piece. So as we were ramping up to really roll this system out to our user community, we ourselves started to use our system in the background, and we saw that we could do releases much easier by having our automation there. Once we brought the release management and the release control on top of that to give the users a much easier way to talk to us and a much easier way to communicate to us, that became a real big win on their side, because it now showed them all the work that we had been doing about trying to give them a better system to work with and trying to increase their workflow. Like I said, we had done it on the back end. The combination of the entire suite across the board, not just the automation piece, but the release control and the vault, really cemented what we were trying to do when we walked into 2013 and said, we are going to automate the release management process. And that's been a great win, but we still have plenty of work to do. And some of the things that we have scheduled for the 2014 year are really expanding the system. I've talked about that we have a sort of a disconnectedness with our change management system. We use BMC's Remedy system as our change control system, and one of my key initiatives for 2014 is the integration of Serena and the Remedy system. One of the niceties that we'll have with the completion of that initiative is it will do away with double entry, because that's one of the issues we still really have, is that the information that's currently going into the Serena system and release management system has to be duplicated in the change management system, because that's the system of record for all the changes that go into production. That's where audit's going to want to go to make sure that all the right things have been done to put things into production. Our goal is to take information out of the Serena system and move it into the change control system, into Remedy. But the end users, my users, will only have to deal with the release management system. They won't have to do double entry. Again, trying to improve the process, not just from a release management standpoint, but for the developers as well, which will be a big win for the organization, because it will allow the developers to work at a faster pace. Again, we'll turn around our releases much quicker. Some of the things that we'll talk about and we'll do is, you see I talk about bi-directional integration. Well, one of the things we don't want to have to wait for an email from the change management system before we know that something's ready for production. We want our change management system to tell the release management system that this release has now been approved by all the people who need to approve it, and it's ready to go to production. So that's a major initiative for us this year. Another initiative, and this is a request that came from our application support manager. They would like to have a little bit more checks and balances put into the release request process. So we're looking at a way to sort of integrate just peer reviews. It's really sort of a stage gate that someone else will look at that person's work before it comes into the release process. So those are some things that the users are asking for us. We're converting our build management system over to Jenkins, and we will be integrating our build management system with the release automation system, because we're really trying to, again, move to a much quicker delivery cycle. So we want to move a little bit closer to possibly continuous delivery as we possibly can. And by implementing Jenkins and integrating that with Serena Release Automation, that will facilitate making our releases much quicker. There are some other things that we do here that are kind of unique to us, I suppose. We do, on instances, have releases that will never go to production. They are done specifically in the UAT environment. Now, we don't want to go outside of our normal flow to facilitate a developer being able to just release something into the UAT environment. We want them to stay within the process. So we're looking at ways of enhancing the system so that they can do a release only to the UAT environment, but it will still go through our normal flow of what our system does. So we're really looking at that. And we feel that that's something that we can provide the end users. We do have some policy from a change management perspective that's vital to the way we run our organization here. When things go to production, as many of you probably know, you can put something in production and, a day or two later, we got to make this slight change to that. We allow, within our change management policy, we allow a release to be re-released into the production environment under the same ticket. So you're still within that policy window that says a change can be fixed or changed within a 3 business day policy. As release management, that release still has to come through our release process, which means if they're making a change to that release that they did just 1 day ago, you still have to go through the normal process, which means you have to go into UAT, you have to do your testing. The only thing that you don't have to do readily is go back through the approval process and change management. Because we're doing the integration between the release system and the change management system, we now need to to facilitate doing those re-releases to production within the context of we're doing integration. So we're looking at ways that we can provide that methodology and that functionality to our user base as well. Again, we want everything to begin in the release management system, and we'll just flow information over to the change management system. Obviously, as an organization, we do have some applications that are off the shelf and that are larger enterprise-wide applications. A lot of those things, because of we're going to a more automated system, what I want to begin doing is looking at is expanding the use of the tool to a lot of that side of the organization. There's a lot of information that's there that we can use the entire suite across the board to begin to manage the way a lot of those applications go out as well. So there's some work we're going to be doing there to look at how we can expand the use of the tool to handle doing deployments for our COTS applications. And one of the things that our DBA has spoken to me about is assuming all the responsibilities for all of the Oracle releases. He's highly on board with that. And we're looking at how we'll be able to do that. Some of the releases we do now, because we primarily do SQL Server, there's a lot of stuff built around how we do our SQL Server releases that ensure everything gets done the correct way. Some of that is slightly different on the Oracle side. So it's a matter of understanding the differences between doing a huge Oracle release and a huge SQL Server release. But we will be looking at assuming the responsibilities for those types of releases as well. And those are all things that we're trying to do for 2014, and we're confident that we can put these initiatives in place. And again, begin to move the process forward, begin to improve the process, and make our release cycle much quicker and much smoother for the end user. Let's just sum up and talk about where the 2 different pieces sort of have benefited us here. From the the release manager suite as a whole, we now have full control and full visibility over what's going into UAT and production. And that's been a major win, not just for my department, as I said, but for the users as well, because there's a lot more information. They know exactly where to go to find out what state things are in. When it comes to an established release process, everybody now understands exactly how things go through the system. Whether I'm doing a release or a member of my team is doing the release is done exactly the same way. So with the holiday coming up, I'll be in the office on Wednesday and Friday. There's going to be some releases there, but if there's some things that are done on Monday and Tuesday when I'm not in the office, those things might go to UAT and be released on Friday or Wednesday. with an automated system, with all the controls we put in place, I now have 100% confidence that that release is going to go into the production environment without any flaws, because we've done so much work with the system to ensure that our process flow is going to always be consistent no matter who's doing that release. We talked about separation of duties. Again, because developers now must submit everything through the release process, we're the only ones who can do those releases into those environments. So everything's going through our process. Everything is in an automated fashion, so we know exactly when it went into production, we know exactly who put it into production, and we know exactly what went into production. So those are all things that have been a major improvement that started at the beginning of 2013, but we're a long time coming. With the automation as a whole, because we're no longer logging on to servers and we're no longer downloading files manually to staging areas, we've introduced a secure and a controlled path, not just to UAT, but to production in general. And that was a key and critical piece of something I wanted to do. Yeah, I talk about here the gold source. I want to know from a release management perspective, I want to know exactly what went into production, and I want to know exactly where it came from. Release automation has enabled me to do that. I know that the code that I'm releasing, it has been now brought into my control, and it hasn't changed since I brought it under my control. That was a critical piece as well, so that you don't introduce a latent change to some script or to some page or to some artifact that was done outside of the control of release management. That was vitally important as part of what I wanted to do. Also, the ability to do the rollback. If something happens on a release, and it might not be part of the process, it just might be we don't need that change, and now can we back it out? We now have that ability to roll back the system to the previous known good state. That's a very, very, very important aspect that we didn't have. Our process before then was, well, we can't roll back, we need to roll forward. So that was a major, major improvement that we did by having the system come in. We've accelerated our deployments threefold, if not more, only because everything now is well thought out. Everything goes through the same exact process. So it's allowed us to speed up our deployments. Right now, because we've virtually automated virtually everything, I can actually be sitting in a meeting, and if a deployment has to go out at the time that I'm in a meeting, I can do that deployment from sitting in that meeting because everything is already staged to move through the process in an automated fashion. That's a major, major win for the organization as far as well as our users. And the underlying reality is we've improved our success rate. We have way more control, and no matter who is doing the release is always done exactly the same way. So we have a repeatable process, which is highly important for any release process. It needs to be done exactly the same way by any person who's doing that release. So in summary, that's really a lot of the stuff that we've done. And release automation and release control and the release vault have enabled us to really, really move forward from having a highly manual process. It's allowed us to really, really show benefit to our users by allowing them to develop as fast as the business needs them to, because at the end of the day, our job is to facilitate the business need. And if we need to develop and release faster to accomplish the mission of the organization, the mission of the business, we need to find a way to do that. Release automation, release control, and the release vault have enabled us to deliver that, enabled me to deliver it to the developers, which allows our developers to deliver the features and the functionality that the business wants in their applications. And that's our story here at Eaton Vance. That's what we've done for 2013, and we've got some good stuff coming in 2014. Jonathan?
Thank you, Richard. That's an absolutely fantastic story. We've had a few questions coming in. Some have been related to the Serena product suite as a whole, and a lot about the Eaton Vance story in particular. So before we go into the general Q&A session, just let me pop up a couple of slides on the Serena products. I'm going to keep this very short because the audience definitely wants to ask you a few questions.
Okay.
So we talked about different solutions that you have in use, and one of them is the Serena Release Control Layer. As I said, it's a browser-based workflow with a visual release calendar. We have a lot of customers that really do have the same needs as Eaton Vance, where it's not just about automation. You need that control so you can have the auditability, compliance, and a central view of the world. So that's had some quite good traction around the world. And the other part of the software that Richard has been using is our release automation product, which handles the punching out of actual bits to the servers. Now, one question that's come up is that Richard has talked about the release vault, where he's getting the artifacts deployed to servers. So one question that came is, does that actually tie in with only Serena products, or will it integrate with Subversion and other source control or artifact repositories? Well, the answer to that is yes. One of the key goals of Serena is that we don't want people to have to rip and replace. If you want to actually embrace an end-to-end Serena solution, then that's wonderful for us. But if you have other tools and technologies in place, you can easily slot them in to work with our release management solutions. So we definitely don't push you down a path to, this only really works if you adopt Serena technologies as a whole. But now, Richard, I'm going to go to a couple of questions that come specifically for you. This question is from Bill. How many applications move to the centralized system, and is the support model worldwide or for co-located teams?
We have right now currently, from an automation standpoint, we probably release about 50 to 60 different applications. Now, there are two special instances, and the two special instances is when I talked about our ETL process and when I talked about our workload automation process. It's slightly different there only because the ETL is a system as a whole, but within that system we have probably 100 different ETL applications. But again, that's one central release process for each and every one of those applications because they're always released exactly the same way. But when you're talking about the different applications, and when I talk about different, I'm talking about SQL Server, PHP applications, VB.NET applications. All of those applications are slightly different. The ETL stuff tends to be the same, and so does the workload automation. Primarily, much of the requests come from internal, from the Boston department. We do have a couple that come in from our Seattle office, and we do have a gentleman in London who does submit releases. So we're a little bit worldwide, but we're primarily here in Boston.
Thanks, Richard. There's a couple of questions from Ian. So first of all, is the only approval necessary to deploy to production the CAB? Do you not have a release gate or some pseudo go, no-go?
The go, no-go is going to be more so in the cab. The way our cab works is by the time the developer or whoever's in charge, maybe the project manager, has done all their work, they'll come to CAB for their release. And usually we have our CAB meetings every Wednesday. There we get an opportunity to discuss and look at that release in the context of all releases going out throughout the organization. Now, that release might be in conflict with something that might be going on the server team. at that point they might raise an issue. But from a go no go perspective, we're not sort of in that conversation because from on the quality assurance side, I would think that your no go might be because you haven't reached the threshold of successful testing. Therefore, you're not ready to move into the approval process. So, from a perspective of looking at a go no go, a lot of times our no-goes are probably because they don't feel that the testing has been successful enough. It's very rare that by the time you get to the cab, that you're not going to get through the cab. The cab is really making sure that everyone's aware of what's happening in the organization so that we can understand what conflicts may occur if that release is going out at that time. So it's a lot about talking about the releases in the cab approval, but certainly I haven't seen that many no-goes come out of the cab, but it can happen.
And a second part to the question from Ian, equally, is UAT the final testing environment before deployment? Do you not have any kind of staging environment?
We do not. We used to be a four-tiered environment, and what we found was that we had development, QA, UAT, and then production. UAT was our sort of staging environment, and we found that it having a QA didn't really lend itself to really helping us. Much of the UAT is really about the developer doing their own testing there to make sure that they're comfortable putting it in front of the business to say, okay, go look and make sure this does exactly what you need it to do. So from a staging perspective, it's not necessarily a staging, but it is the final place that it's going to be before it goes to production. And at that point, the developers have already looked at what they've done to ensure it meets the needs of what the business wanted. And at that point, the business does their sign-off, and then it goes through the approval process.
Okay, thanks. So I know we're coming close to the top of the hour, but I've got a couple of things I want to cover. But there's one important question from Adrian that just came in that I'd like to put by you. How many users does your system have? How many applications are released through your system? And how long did it take to implement the solution?
Currently, we have about 25 different developers who are developing a variety of things that we're doing releases for. As a whole, if I include the different ETL releases, which there are hundreds of those, there are also hundreds of releases on the workload automation side. And there, like I said, I think there's about 35 to 50 different applications. So when you put it all together, you're talking well over probably close to 200 different things, but I don't like to consider the ETL stuff as multiples because it follows one process. So I would say, between 35 and 50 different individual types of applications. There was another part of that question. Could you repeat it, please?
Yeah. And how long has it taken you to implement this solution? I know you've done it in various phases. So what would be
we started in February of 2013, and we were fully live by, I believe, July.
Thanks, Richard. I've really enjoyed your story. It's been, I've heard about it at the Soon Exchange conference, and I was really excited about, the success that Richard and his team have had personally, working on this. It's really made a difference to how they work daily, and it's definitely had a positive impact on on their careers, I think, and their work-life balance. So what I would like to do finally now is that we talked about our release management solutions. I'd like to say that we have a couple of webinars coming up in December. First, we have a session with Kurt Bittner. They're going to be discussing DevOps from the development perspective. But the big news for December is the fact that we have a new release coming up of our RLM suite. I know Richard has seen it and is quite excited. we'll be having a webcast, let's say a live demo of the solution. It really is quite revolutionary as far as how to manage releases on an enterprise scale. And I really hope that you can actually join us because it's going to be it's a very exciting release for Serena. So with that, I'd like to thank you again, Richard. It's been really fantastic having you here. And I'd like to thank all of the attendees. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar just as much as I have.
Thank you, John. My pleasure.
Okay, thank you, everybody. And join us in December for the next series in the DevOps Drive-In.